Nammo Phat. Good morning. Thank you for joining me this Friday morning, May 8th, for our daily practice check-in. Listen, listen, listen. This beautiful sound calls us back to our true home. This morning we're reciting the 5th mindfulness training. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful consumption, I vow to cultivate good health, both physical and mental, for myself, my family, and my society, by practicing mindful eating, drinking, and consuming. I will ingest only items that preserve peace, well-being, and joy in my body, in my consciousness, and in the collective body and consciousness of my family and society. I am determined not to use alcohol or any other items that contain toxins, such as certain TV programs, magazines, books, films, and conversations. I am aware that to damage my body or my consciousness with these poisons is to betray my ancestors, my parents, my society, and future generations. I will work to transform violence, fear, anger, and confusion in myself and in society by practicing a diet for myself and for society. I understand that a proper diet is crucial for self-transformation and the transformation of society. Today we're reading the section on reaping and clearing results from the past from Ajahn Sucitto's book, Kamma and the End of Kamma. Afflictive patterns such as depression, anxiety, resentment, and guilt act as a dead weight on the potential of the mind. So when the memory process brings these up, we need to clear them for other people's welfare as well as our own. This process of clearing, as outlined by the Buddha, is twofold. First, to acknowledge the results of action and to determine not to act in such ways again. And secondly, to spread inclinations of goodwill through the whole system and towards anyone else connected to the action. So the past doesn't go away by itself. When you commit an unwholesome deed, it leaves a strong and lingering impression. Then, when there is a memory, it brings up the mood and image of that action. It seems as if the past comes flooding back, but how could it do that if it's really past? What has actually happened is that the past event has laid down a sankhara pattern, a kind of track in the current of the mind. Then, a program in the present sends mental energy down that track and the past comes back. That's the way the mind is. The patterns and programs of sankhara, good and bad, are the means through which the mind operates. They formulate our self-image, and they can bring the past to the surface independently of one's wishes. That's how the past, and who we see ourselves as being, stays with us. Any form of abuse, physical, verbal, psychological, of others or of oneself, closes down or perverts the mind's sensitivity. And all that leaves its track as memory, or vipaka. Even unskillful thoughts have that effect, particularly as we can do them many times more than we can physical deeds. If we allow the mind to repeatedly formulate deceit, jealousy, or even guilt, that creates a track down which the emotional and psychological energies will run. It's likely that sooner or later, physical or verbal actions will move down that track. But even without that, attitudes and ways of thought will occur that have strong effects on the mind. People can harbor grudges and recite the wrongs that have been done to them for years after the event. And they can also feel chronic guilt and despondency over the actions they have done, or be running programs of self-disparagement and lack of worth over the actions and attitudes that they have been the recipients of. Where still, when it's bound up with a self-view, we don't notice it as much. It's so ingrained that it becomes normal. That inadequate self is who I am. And that self-view is then the basic program that affects every action of our lives. So if what I notice in the present, what I remember of the past, what I imagine about the future, and even how I conceive myself are not unvarnished truth, but dependent on Kamma, what do I do to get clear of living out old Kamma with its habits and biases? The Buddha defines Kamma as intention. That is, intention doesn't create Kamma. Intention, impulse energy, that in itself is Kamma. Kamma is not some remote, faceless deity or automatic system that adds up the good you've done, subtracts all the bad you've done from that sum, and then comes out with a result. Kamma is the flush in our nervous systems, the swell of brightness in the heart, or the hardening of the gaze. One of the first things we find out through Dhamma practice is the kind of potential we're carrying in these sankhara. And the second is that we don't have to act upon it or react to it. And finally, that it is through accessing the pattern of our skillful Kamma that we begin to clear the past. What needs to be cleared occurs on 3 levels. There are active patterns, the programs that are running. There are involuntary tendencies, programs that lie dormant but come to the surface under stress, or as the mind unfolds in meditation. And finally, there's the self-view. In all cases, the method entails accessing the patterns and programs of old Kamma in the mind and revealing their track. So, the good news is that because karma moves along these tracks, clearing the past is not a matter of going through every specific act of wrongdoing we've done. It's more a case of straightening, uprooting, or leaving the track. At the first, most obvious level, that of acknowledging actions and of changing how we're going to act in the future, we own up to any unskillful deed we feel we've done and reflect on the underlying pattern. It's not enough to try and change without looking into how it is that we act and what tendencies move us. But if we do, then it's likely that we'll start to reveal the underlying tendencies. Sometimes it's just the tendency of ignorance that makes us careless or inconsiderate of how we affect others. At any rate, when we look into that and comprehend that the pattern doesn't feel good and doesn't do anywhere good, we can deeply intend or vow to refrain from acting in such ways in the future. And then the general theme of practice is to spread loving kindness, metta, compassion, karuna, appreciative joy, mudita, and equanimity, upaka, with regard to other beings we feel we may have affected. It's also the case that we should cultivate the same qualities towards our own hearts when they have become infected with violence or deceitfulness, and so on. The practice covers both ourselves and others, because in the heart, self and other are interdependent. That is, our personality is established and molded dependent on whom we're interacting with. This is obviously the case when we're in the presence of people who have been either hostile or welcoming towards us. We may feel and act like a victim or like an old friend. So, when we recollect an unskillful deed we've done towards another, we also bring to mind the insensitive personality we may have been at that time. And when we remember ourselves as the object of others' abuse or lack of empathy, we do much the same. We have to take the whole scenario of who we feel we've been and who we feel the other has been, and suffuse the entirety with goodwill. The Buddha uses the simile of someone blowing on a conch to describe the sending forth of kindness or compassion or appreciative joy or equanimity, one or all of them. Collectively, they're called the measureless intent, because their sound blows without restriction in all directions, to others as to oneself, to the heart that acted on those energies, and to any others who have been affected by them. Exactly what tune one plays is something that arises dependent on the distortion one is healing. There are pains that bring up the awareness of the basic need for the nourishing quality of kindness, whereas sometimes the awareness of how volatile and vulnerable we all are calls forth compassion, the protective energy. Sometimes it's the case whereby we recognize the harm that comes from neglecting what is good in ourselves and others, or even through taking others for granted. Then the sense in appreciating goodness, however obscured, can arise. It's important to not neglect this one, the stream of good deeds that you did do, the kind words that just seemed natural, but were the right thing at the right time. It's important not to overlook it, because we so often do. Equanimity holds the empathic space, and allows things to unfold. It doesn't ask for results, but attunes to how things are right now. It is where the issue of karma comes to an end, because it is imbued with the understanding that ultimately no one did anything. There was patterning based on previous actions and on what each person has had done to them. In the world in general, there's a huge inheritance of abusive patterns based upon violence and deprivation, and who knows where all that began. But instead of blaming and agonizing, we can regard our own and other people's actions in terms of cause and effect. That regard is equanimity, the most reliable base for action. May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. Sadhu. 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 Thank you for joining me this morning, and I hope you have a very lovely weekend.